On our previous visit to the south of France, we had not spent much time in Avignon. We had visited the major sites of the Palais des Papes and the well-known Avignon Bridge, the Pont Saint-Benizet. This time we located a gîte about 15 minutes from Avignon, planning to spend more time in Avignon. As it turned out, we only spent one full day there because other areas also attracted us. Welcome to France in 2014. In Avignon, the area near Les Halles, the market, was where we started. The interesting area along Rue des Teinturiers, Street of the Dyers, where the textile and dyeing industry was located, was our first objective. Along this Rue des Teinturiers runs a small canal fed by the River Sword, which powered the industry through water wheels. Pleasant little squares like this, Place des Corsants, are everywhere in France to provide the opportunity for a drink and a rest before continuing on. Beside some old Roman ruins is a modern church, that is, from medieval times. Considering Rue de la République is the main street, it is quite attractive, with various decorative features. Along the way, we followed it to the Place de l'Horloge, the clock tower square. Since this was a Sunday, the double-decker carousel attracted the kids, and the sidewalk cafes in the square were busy. The impressive Opera House is located on the square. Having had enough for our first day, we headed back to our gîte. The only remaining part of the Pont d'Avignon, the Avignon Bridge, is on the Avignon side of the Rhone River. The tower protecting the far side of the bridge in medieval times, seen in this old drawing, is the Tour de Philippe le Bel, the Tower of Philip the Fair. We went to see this other remnant of the famous bridge on the other side of the river. When we got to the tower, we were surprised to see these tropical plants. We were able to enter the tower and see some of the original material. We climbed to the top, from where we could watch a cruise boat on the river. Also on this side of the river is the small town of Villeneuve-les-Avignon, that translates as the new town near Avignon. It is a quiet little town now, more pleasant for a drink or a pastry than Avignon itself. When the popes lived in the Palais des Papes, many of the cardinals lived here. Protecting the area was Fort André. Prior to 1481, the countries of France and Provence were separated by the Rhone River. This fort was a border protection fort. It was a bit of a climb to the fort entrance way up there. This sign says it is a rapid climb, but it wasn't for us. The walls are still in good shape. From up here we had a good view of Villeneuve. The interior of this fort is striking. With modern facilities. Also here is the large monastery, La Chartreuse, built on land that Pope Innocent VI had owned as a cardinal and donated for the creation of the monastery in 1352. Over the centuries, the monastery grew richer and more beautiful. Its 3 cloisters made it the biggest Carthusian monastery in France. Some of the detail on the gate still shows the original style and beauty. This portion of the entrance shows the difference between 2 periods of the construction. Despite the damaged, collapsed wall of the chapel, we can see the inspiring nature of the monastery. At his request, Pope Innocent VI was buried in this mausoleum in the chapel when he died in 1362. Although we returned to Avignon and Villeneuve for short visits, we were attracted to small towns east of Avignon, to which we returned on other days. From a friend, I had heard about the town of Simian-la-Rotonde, about 1.5 hours from our gîte. The rotonde, or hall, for which the town was named, is the large round tower at the top of the hill. It was part of a castle that was built in the 12th century. We enjoyed our walk through the steep, narrow streets as we searched for a restaurant, eventually finding this tiny one. We stumbled onto this 16th century covered market, from which we had a great view of the countryside. And then we climbed back up to where we'd parked the car. The town of Monteux was one of our first dinner spots. The old part of the town is behind the tower, where the market is held. This town had caught my eye because of the trompe l'oeil paintings on so many of the buildings in the old town. The 20-kilometer drive through the Gorge de la Nesque was beautiful and stimulating, but not nearly as stimulating for us as it was for the motorcyclists and bikers. We stopped at a number of turnouts, since I couldn't enjoy much of the view when I was driving. like someone was paying more attention to the scenery and missed the turn. Throughout the drive, there were a number of these tunnels, each marked to show that we had the priority through it. Close to the end of our drive through the gorge, we stopped in the village of Monyu for a snack. By the way, this wasn't a one-way street we were on. By climbing to the upper levels of the village, we had a nice view of the area and also got to an old church. Beside the church is what appeared to be the bell tower from an even older church. The interior was peaceful and cool. On another day, we did a different tour to the east, to the villages of La Roque-sur-Perne, Venasque, Saint-Didier, and Perne-les-Fontaines. We started at La Roque-sur-Perne. From the remains of the communal olive oil press, we climbed the steep, narrow streets to the chateau, now a hotel. Venasque was the most picturesque of towns we visited on this day. We stopped for lunch at the Hotel Les Remparts, so named because of its location on the ramparts, or walls surrounding the town. Saint-Didier was a short photo opportunity where the pollarded trees on the main street provided an arch from which we could view the church. Perne-les-Fontaines was our last stop for the day. It offered us another steep climb up the dungeon tower. From the top of the tower, we had a great view of the surrounding countryside. Fontaine de Vaucluse has a reputation as a pretty town, and it is. Unfortunately, that means it attracts a lot of tourists. We travelers have been known to complain about the tourists. On the top of the mountain overlooking the town are the ruins of the chateau of the bishops of Cavaillon. The town gets its name from the fact that it is located at the source of the Sword River, which provides a pleasant location for kayakers and the many restaurants. The spring has been measured to have a depth of 308 meters, over 1,000 feet. The remaining water wheel is a souvenir of earlier times. The museum in the former paper mill is another reminder of the past. This column is in honor of the Italian poet Petrarch, who lived here in the 14th century. We return to the Luberon area on our way back from Fontaine de Vaucluse. On our trip 2 years previously, the Luberon had been our favorite area. We stopped at the village of Lacoste for lunch, with another pleasant view. On our previous trip, Rita had missed the visit to the medieval village, so we climbed up the narrow, steep streets to the castle of the infamous Marquis de Sade, so she could have a taste of this interesting spot. The only other large city in this area that we had planned to visit was Nîmes. Famous for textile manufacturing, in the 17th century they created what is known as denim cloth, that is, serge de Nîmes. I'd heard about the Roman amphitheater or arena here. Because the arena has been continuously inhabited as a fortress, as the residence of the Viscounts of Nîmes, and then cluttered with private homes, it is well preserved, so it was worth the visit. It continues to be used for spectaculars, including French-style bullfighting, where the bull is not killed. However, when we started researching the city, we learned there were a lot of things to see. The Maison Carrée is a very well-preserved Roman temple. Located ideally in an open square. Dating from the 1st century BC, it was dedicated to the adopted grandsons of Augustus Caesar. The Maison Carrée is used to show an interesting video on the formation of Nîmes by a Gallic tribesman who went off to fight for the Romans for 15 years and returned with a war chest that permitted him to establish the town. With the restaurants around the square, it seemed like an ideal spot for lunch. After a tourist trolley ride around the city, we returned to some of the highlights we had seen. On our way back to the car, we followed the canal that goes beside the garden and other interesting spots. The beautiful Jardin de la Fontaine attract people to play boule or just to walk. The coat of arms of the city comes from Roman times. It is a crocodile chained to a palm tree, signifying the victory in 31 BC of Octavius over Antony and Cleopatra's fleet in Egypt. Finally, we came back to where we started and waved goodbye to the Gallic Roman founder of the city. While reading about things to do around Nîmes, Rita learned about another interesting city nearby, Uzès. In this town we had our first salette, a crepe made with whole wheat. This one with ham, eggs, and mushrooms was delicious. The cathedral with its bell tower and the bishop's palace were destroyed and rebuilt twice during the religious wars. We followed a walking tour around the old town. The squares were lively spots, full of people, some artists, and more sidewalk cafes. The mairie had this impressive tower. The highlight was a tour of the chateau in the middle of the old town, known as the Duchy. The tower can be seen from most points in the town. As you get closer, the roof is a striking feature. In the courtyard, where we waited for the tour to start, we had time to inspect some of the details of the architecture. Unfortunately for us, the tour was given in French, but we got the drift. The tour started in the cave, or wine cellar. I think there were some historic items in the rooms we visited, but we satisfied ourselves with looking at the elegant interior. And that ended today's tour. The city of Tarascon is the home of the Tarasque, a mythical medieval beast that ate humans. This statue of the mascot of the city shows us what it was purported to look like. There is an annual festival built around this legend. Across the street from the statue is the Church of St. Martha. Legend has it that she came to Provence to spread Christianity, and in the process she killed the Tarasque that had been terrorizing the population. Martha, the sister of Mary Magdalene, is mentioned in the Bible as the one who made supper for Jesus while Mary was washing his feet. Her response when Mary criticized her for not attending to Jesus was, "Someone has to work around the house." When I was studying engineering at the U of T, the students of the engineering faculty referred to themselves as the Sons of Martha, since someone had to do the work of society. The crypt in this church holds the relics of St. Martha. Near the church is the Château de Tarascon. Built between 1400 and 1435, it was the base for the Counts of Anjou, who controlled Provence until it became part of France in 1481. Although it is not furnished, the structure is the most impressive of any we saw on this trip. Once inside the outer gate, there is another gate. Then a garden. In contrast to the austere exterior walls, the Court of Honor is ornately decorated. Since this was the home of the Anjou Counts, Louis II and his son, King René, the rooms were elegant, with an ensuite bathroom for the king, and have been refurbished to that condition. In the banquet room, there is some interesting graffiti. Heading up to the roof, the large flat area affords a 360-degree view of the surroundings, including the Rhone River. From up here, we have an even closer view of some of the gargoyles. We went back down the long spiral staircase to end our visit to this chateau. Having done our touring early in the day, we returned to our car and went searching in the old part of the town to find a spot for lunch. We found this sidewalk cafe near the mairie or town hall. The street was quiet because this was the holiday of Pentecost and shops were closed. These cannonballs to restrict parking are probably left over from the War of 1812. On our drive to Vaison-la-Romaine, we stopped in Orange. We visited the impressive Roman theater when we were here before. This time I wanted to climb the hill behind the theater to get an overview of the theater. Unfortunately, the hill is overgrown and the view wasn't as good as I hoped. There is also a Roman Arc de Triomphe in Orange that we hadn't seen on the previous trip. The detail on the arch is still amazing after 2 millennia. Vaison-la-Romaine beckoned for us to return on this trip. Previously, we had found the town pretty, and the B&B and its owners really great. On this trip, we knew exactly where the B&B was and where to park. We walked down the narrow street and entered through the door, almost hidden by the ivy. The ground floor is a pleasant common area. Our room was on the next floor. Small but comfortable. The breakfast area, with its view of the town, is a pleasant place to start the day. Coming down from our B&B to the lower town and crossing the old Roman bridge, we went to the busy weekly market to stock up on some cheese. The market occupies all the main streets of the lower town. We return to the Fête de Provence Hotel for another great meal. Snails and frog's legs for my appetizer. The belfry for which the Hotel Le Beffroi is named is a major landmark. The hotel garden near our B&B was where we frequently took our afternoon break, overlooking the lower town. We drove around the Côte d'Iron wine area. Stopping at Gigondas for lunch in the shady main square. 2 years ago, when we had tried to have lunch at this restaurant, we had arrived on the day it was closed. Later in the day, we continued our circuit around the Dentelle, a ridge of small mountains. We stopped at Suzette, in a restaurant named after the poppies we have seen everywhere. Situated on top of a hill, it was a pleasant spot for a drink in the middle of the afternoon, and then back to our B&B. On the advice of the owner of the B&B, on another day we went to the town of Grignan. The chateau is imposing from far away or up close. Originally built in the 12th century, it was turned into a fortress, then a manor house. Destroyed during the French Revolution, it was returned to its former glory at the beginning of the 20th century by Madame Fontaine, who spent her entire fortune on the project. It is now owned by the Department of Drôme. Situated on a solitary rock, from the terrace it seems like we can see forever. Spread below us is the town of Grignan with its narrow streets. Later in the day we went to a nearby town called Dieu-le-Fit. The interesting name translates as God made it. Once off the main street, there are some fascinating little spots to be found up these steep, narrow streets. Communal water taps are still in use. On the other side of the main street, families make use of the river. One of the big attractions in this area is the Ardèche Gorge. It is larger than the Gorge de l'Anesque we had visited near Avignon and crowded with tourists. The highlight is the Pont de l'Arc, a natural bridge over the river. The tourists include busloads of seniors, as well as young kids learning how to canoe down a fast-flowing river. Not all of them successfully. The drive through the gorge was pleasant with many viewpoints. Until we came down from the Ardèche Plateau to the Rhône Valley again. Beaujolais was a brand new region for us to visit. It is, of course, famous for wine, and it was conveniently close to Provence. It was a relatively long drive, about 3 hours to Argite, north of Lyon. Beaujolais is as pretty as our favorite area, the Luberon. Finding Argite that was well off the beaten track was challenging, since the address wasn't in the database of my GPS. We found the nearby town of Taizé, but the roads beyond that were confusing. However, eventually our hostess found us and led us home. The gîte seemed like a strange design at first, since it was located over a garage, but it wound up being very nice, and the owner, Monique, was extremely pleasant to us. On one evening, she invited us to a vendange, a wine tasting in the caveau, the wine cellar in a different part of the building that housed our accommodation. Her husband had sold grapes from his vineyard here. The gîte was built in the late 1800s, each room having a fireplace that fortunately we didn't have to use. Since we were well out in the country, we toured through several pleasant small villages in the area. Charnay, where the mairie is located in what used to be the chateau. In Ternan, there are ruins of a chateau destroyed by the Huguenots during the religious wars. We went back into the hills one day. It was out of our way, but we wanted to drive through some of the forests that we could see from the valley. We came down into the village of Wank, a name that I found very humorous to pronounce. This village shows off the honey-colored stone from which buildings are constructed in this region. On another day, we took a longer tour, crossing the Saône River at Villefranche, going north to Mâcon and crossing back to the west side of the river. The aim on this day was to visit 3 villages that are well known for their wine: Fouissé, Juliena, and Fleury. I was surprised to learn that they are in the Burgundy region. We almost missed the delightful restaurant in Fuissé where we had lunch on the terrace, accompanied by a wine from the area. A wine that is now stocked in our wine cellar at home. As nice as the countryside was around our gîte, there was much to see in Lyon, so we went there on 5 of the 7 days we spent in this area. An interesting walking tour of Lyon starts in the main plaza, the Place Bellecour, in the center of town, seen here. Crossing the Saône River to the Old Town and Notre Dame Basilica on Fourvière Hill, we followed the tour to the Cathedral of Saint-Jean. Then we followed the main street, Rue Saint-Jean. We took the funicular up the Fourvière Hill to the Basilica of Notre Dame. The main part of the basilica is dedicated to Mary. And in it are mosaics telling the stories of Christianity in France. From up here, the central part of Lyon can be seen, bordered by the Saône River on this side and the Rhône River on the other side. Near the basilica are 2 Roman theaters. The larger one, seating 10,000, was used for plays, and it is being set up for the annual Nuit de Fourvière festival. As is the smaller Odeon Theatre, seating 3,000, which was used for public readings and musical performances. This museum tells the story of the Gauls and Romans in Lyon, the most important city in Roman Gaul. This ceremonial bronze chariot from 700 BC is unique in Europe. It would have been used in religious processions. An example of the Romans' technical capability is this model of a theater curtain being raised from under the stage. Another example is this 2-cylinder water pump, carved out of oak with bronze liners in which pistons slid up and down. Driving in and into the city was challenging. The modern public transit system included these subway cars without drivers. It was extremely simple to get anywhere in the city using the subway, trams, or buses. North of the central part of Lyon is the hilly Croix-Rousse section. We took the subway uphill so we could walk down the stairs. On one day, we came across this delightful wine bar for lunch. The Theatre of the Three Gauls is located here. It would be a major tourist site if not overshadowed by the theaters on Fourvière Hill. Below this area is the Place des Terreaux, where we had lunch on another day, beside the fountain by the grandiose Hôtel de Ville or City Hall. Our trip was almost over as we headed back down the autoroute to Marseille to fly home. As we left Beaujolais for Marseille, Monique, our hostess, warned us to be careful of les gangsters in Marseille. Despite a reputation as a rough city, it has some spots that are worth seeing. It's easy to see why so many people promenade around the port in the evening. We went into the Panier district, the old town, to see the Vieille Charité, a building constructed in the 1600s, originally to house the poor who were rounded up and locked up there as a workhouse. It is now a museum and cultural center. The building under the dome is the chapel. On the far side of the Panier district is the Cathédrale de la Major. Built in the late 1800s, it is one of the grand cathedrals of the world. A beautiful structure constructed with green stone from Florence, white marble from Carrara, stone from Calissaint and Garde in France, onyx from Italy and Tunisia, and mosaics from Venice. We concluded our visit by going up to Notre-Dame de la Garde, that sits high above the city. Next to the port, it is the highlight of the city. It is beautiful both outside and inside. From there, the size of the city is apparent. Just outside the harbor is the Château d'If, the prison from which the fictional Count of Monte Cristo escaped. Although we passed many chateaux on our drives, we only visited a couple. It's great that France has refurbished so many of them. It's such a marvelous heritage that has been maintained despite the French Revolution that ended the lives of so many who lived in the chateaux. As well as Lyon and Nîmes that were on our itinerary, we found and visited cities we didn't even know existed prior to this trip. Uzès and Tarascon among them. The villages, both around Avignon and up in Burgundy and Beaujolais, were delightful. They are so picturesque. One explanation of why there are so many Roman ruins in southern France is that it's a nice place to retire. The government in Rome didn't want a lot of unemployed, trained soldiers sitting around in Rome, so they were given land in Provence when they retired. The Beaujolais and Burgundy countryside are extremely pleasant and made better by the delicious wine that comes from these vineyards. France is rightly known for food. We had many good meals, and particularly at one restaurant that is the best we have ever found. It must be apparent that we love our visits to France. We have every intention of going back again. There's so much more we haven't seen yet.